Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next LSX Masterclass. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Baker McKenzie, who will be giving their masterclass around partnering and licensing. Before we get started, just a couple of very brief admin points, just so the session runs as smoothly as possible for everyone involved. This will be a sort of conversational style masterclass with a fantastic panel from Baker McKenzie giving their insights, but please do feel free to ask questions in the chat function, which is in the Zoom bar sort of below you now. Do put them in there, and we will obviously get the panelists to ask the questions sort of as and when is appropriate. Similarly, if you would rather use the raise hand function, you can do so on the little reactions button again at the bottom of your Zoom link. Just click on the smiley face and there is a raise hand option, which if you raise your hand, as you'll see in the top left hand corner, I have a little hand raised, and once the question has been answered, you can lower your hand again. We will also be having a poll sort of at the beginning of this, so I hope everyone is ready to be engaged with that poll. But without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to the moderator for the session. Randy, it is over to you.
Thank you, Becky. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this LSX Licensing Masterclass. I'm Randy Sundberg, the North American Chair of the Healthcare and Life Sciences Industry Group for Baker McKenzie, and I am pleased to introduce my panelists. First of all is Isabella Liu, who is one of our colleagues from our Hong Kong office, and Isabella is the head of our Asia Pacific Intellectual Property and Technology Group. And Isabella advises clients on all kinds of matters relating to the creation, exploitation, and protection of intellectual property, and very focused on the life sciences healthcare industries. Also on the panel are Denis, Segota, and Oren Livne, who both, like me, are part of our New York and Princeton offices. We're focused, the three of us are focused really 100% on life sciences clients, doing collaborations and licensing transactions, product and other kinds of M&A, and related financing transactions. And we work with early stage to global pharmaceutical companies, and I'm going to try and reflect that a little bit in the discussion we have today on licensing deals. We hope that you'll find this session to be informative, and we look forward to Q&A from you. If you'd like to ask us any questions or voice any ideas or thoughts that you have on the topics we're discussing. And as Becky mentioned, we'll be checking the chat function as we go along. If there are any questions that we can't answer or don't have time to answer today, we'd certainly be glad to follow up with you after the event today. And as Becky mentioned, we do have a polling question. So we want to get you guys all warmed up and engaged on the session today. So we look forward to your feedback on the polling question. Becky, can we tee that up now? Great. So if you can let us know which of the answers is closest to your background and your perspective on the industry, we'd certainly appreciate that. And while this is while we're doing the polling, I just want to mention also that in the chat function, there'll be a handout that you're able to access, and that's for your own kind of information on the group of us and what we do a little bit more. So, Becky, is that polling question finished, and can we see the result, or will that come up later?
No, I can. I was just waiting for. I think everyone's pretty much done it now, so I'll end the poll, and you should hopefully be able to see the results.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so largely biotech, a good healthy amount of kind of med tech, health tech, and some VC. And I think that we've got good experience with all of those sectors, and we look forward to trying to contour our answers as we as we do the session to make it more meaningful for you based on that information. So we appreciate it. So the first topic that we're going to discuss today, we have three topics generally on global versus regional licensing deals, on the fluidity between licensing and M&A, and then on some of the complexities that we're seeing these days in from the technology, more advanced technologies that are being the subject matter of licensing and collaboration deals. So on the first topic on global versus regional licensing deals, I think most of the licensing and collaboration deals that we do are global in nature, but they are not always with only one licensee. So in some deals, the licensor may retain its home region, for instance, the US, for a lot of the companies that we work with, a lot of biotech companies based in the US. We've done deals with biotech companies based in Europe, where they'll retain, if they're in the Nordic states, they'll retain the Scandinavian region and things like that. But usually it's their home territory. And then they'll out-license the rest of the world. And in other deals, we'll see where the licensor may out-license just one smaller but significant country. In the past, we've seen that be Korea, Japan sometimes, and use the licensing fees to fund further pivotal trials for the bigger regions, the US and the EU, for instance. And we sometimes see licensor out-license various regions of the world to different licensees, either because of greater perceived value in that structure, or because only regional licensees perhaps are interested in the product opportunity. So I wanted to ask our panelists about the complexities and differences that they've encountered in global versus regional licensing deals. And Oren, maybe I know that you've got some ideas on this, if you want to address that first.
Sure, thanks, Randy, and great to be here with everyone. I think it's interesting to me how global deals often get the most attention, right? They tend to be larger in some cases, but regional deals have a lot of complexity in them. So Randy touched on some of these things, but I analyze, by analogy, look at sort of renting a house, right? If you rent the whole house, it's a lot simpler than just renting a room in a house where you have to coordinate everything with your other housemates, right? So there's issues of control, who gets to decide what's going to happen with the house, or in our case, with the product. How is decision-making allocated? Is it really just the licensor deciding everything, or does the licensee have a significant voice? And then there's the issue of sort of alignment of economics. In a global deal, everyone is often aligned around the product as a whole globally. In a regional deal, there's different incentives, right? The partner in the local region has an incentive to maximize that region. The licensor is worried about its regions and any other regions that it has economics to, so it's looking from a more global perspective. So there's a lot more from a contractual view that you want to protect in a regional deal, I think, than in a global deal, just because you're not driven by economics sort of in alignment.
Yeah, hi, this is Denis Segota. Nice being here with everyone. So I concur with Oren that global deals sometimes pose less complexities, right? Essentially, you don't need to be concerned about what the other side is doing. Development that can impact the approval process in your territory, sharing improvements, IP improvements, especially on the manufacturing side, sharing pharmacovigilance data and adverse event reporting, having a consistent global messaging, concerns about parallel imports and sales cannibalizing sales in your territory, pricing strategy and how it impacts what the other side's pricing chooses, how it impacts your pricing, right? All of this essentially requires greater coordination amongst the parties. The other thing that I think that Randy pointed out is important, right? When the decision to do a regional deal, right? It's really a valuation issue. The issue is whether in the short term, doing a regional deal can be helpful. You see a lot of regional deals done on China because it's a big market, or Greater China, and you can get an upfront, you could share development funding, and short term that could be very helpful, especially if companies conserving cash or worry about cash flow, or doing, dilutive financings to fund certain things. But, there's a calculus being done whether the regional deal is accretive, in the long term, right? If you do an exit when you want to sell the entire company or sell the asset, right, will the fact that you have already given a slither or part of the asset away impact the total global value of the deal? So that's kind of the calculus being done, whether, to do a regional deal or kind of try to keep the asset whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think that on some of these deals that I've seen, the perception by the licensor is that they'll get greater value from multiple licensees than they will from one licensee for the whole world, or for whatever part of the world they're licensing out versus what they're keeping for themselves. But the complexity is sometimes makes it not worth that additional, if there's going to be some additional amount in the total upfronts versus one bigger upfront, but not as big as the combined from multiple licensees. And in the structure, I think it does impact structure, as I think Denis and Oren, you both touched on, in that the regional deals that I've seen range from being essentially a distribution arrangement, where the licensee has gotten a product approved in its home country. A lot of the ones we deal with, of course, the US, and they are licensing out rights essentially to that product. And so it's a fairly clean, simple deal from the scope of IP involved, from the product rights involved, but it is super complex from the multiple regions, the multiple distributors / licensees involved. And I'm curious, what you've seen in terms of the scope of rights that the regional licensee might have to do some aspects of development of the product, some aspects of maybe even whether it's clinical or any preclinical, versus it being kind of a static. This is the product you've got. Go sell it. Don't do anything else with it.
Yeah, I think at a minimum, there's often going to be some level of development activities that has to happen at a local basis, right? They're going to need to get that product approved in country. So from that perspective, that's generally allowed in the deals. And there's sometimes concerns from the licensor side, like we alluded to, about the global market, right? And ensuring that development activity that's occurring locally doesn't have some negative impact more broadly. So there are often controls put in place, but the local partner is going to need to do something. And then the more flexibility that's granted, the greater the complexity increases, right? If you're going to allow modifications to the product, then you have a whole host of IP questions, right? Who owns that product? Who gets access to it? And then to Denis's point, if you're a biotech and you're out licensing a region and then you're looking to get acquired, is your acquirer going to want to have someone else playing with its compounds, or is it going to want to retain that control? So you sort of have to look at today as well as your future, and what that's going to look like, and what rights you're willing to give up and allow today.
Because I think essentially a range of rights that a licensee may have, from being very narrow to just do essentially territory-specific clinical development if there's some particular study that has to be done in their country or their region, and that's it, to perhaps something broader, but it raises a whole bunch of coordination issues. And Isabella, I know that the further development of a product can raise issues in China, specifically on kind of the growing body of regulations on human genetic information and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about where that stands now?
Sure. Thanks, Randy. And happy to be here and share. I think, as Randy mentioned, I am IP lawyer with background, and really focus on sort of IP and regulatory issues. So I would say, right, Randy, your point about, traditionally granting rights to a particular product and then just sell it in country. I think, speaking about China, right, one of the biggest jurisdictions in Asia Pacific as a region. I think in the old days, right, maybe 10 years ago, that was the case, right, of more happy to just taking distribution rights and sell the product. Certainly not the case anymore. I think there's a policy driver behind it. China really inevitably was on the receiving end of new technologies in earlier licensing deals. But the Chinese sort of central government's policy to move away from generics or sort of lower competitive sort of drug profiles to really focus on drug development and innovation. So strategically, the self-development aspect, right, from the deal is very, very important, I think, for the Chinese players to really gain that ability to develop and have that know-how to then join in the international arena. So I think this underpins many sort of Chinese firms and companies' position in terms of IP, in terms of accessing to broader rights in R&D and data access, so that, you know, generally we also see that push for exclusivity in the transactions. So really aligned with this top policy, you see quite a bit of mandatory laws and regulations that can impact on such licensing deals. I would say there are four broad layers of perhaps control. One is really starting with, you know, foreign investment control. From a technology standpoint, in terms of patent and technology, including know-how licensing, China has mandatory technology transfer regulations that impacts the inflow and outflow of technologies coming in, and also improvement outcome of technology licensed in and going out. What you mentioned, right, in terms of the genetic resource is really a particular regulation and really relevant to the cell and gene therapy that we are seeing as new technologies. There are particular requirements as to IP ownership between the parties. There's also the recordal requirement if you conduct multi-center trials, international trials, for the sort of sharing of that information to be recorded with the local regulator. And I would also mention, again, a very hot topic is the Personal Information Protection Law that just became effective 1st November this year. So under this framework, there's talk about sensitive data, including health data. Also, there's reference to cross-border control. So details are yet to be sort of released. So really remains to be seen how that, you know, will further regulate the sharing of clinical trial and patient data in this kind of drug development collaborations. So I think this really just to frame, right, there's a higher sort of policy that's driving these law and regulations. So the parties really need to understand the limitations on the commercial intentions, and therefore you can build in safeguard provisions. And, you know, in addition, there can be mechanisms to address the risks arising from the levels of control. Thanks, Randy.
Yeah, thanks, Isabella. You know, the complexity of, and the sophistication, I guess, also, of these growing body of regulations in China is something that I've seen impact the deal structures together kind of at the same time as the market in China is being recognized, you know, for several years now as being, you know, so, you know, large and super valuable. And so I think I mentioned, you know, earlier that, you know, one kind of structure on these regional deals is kind of a one-off, that companies will, you know, do a deal in Korea or it used to be Japan, less so Japan now because it's a big market, but an important market, but smaller, like Korea, to get some funds in, to get the product exploited a little bit, show value, but not give the world away. And China used to, from my experience, used to kind of be in that category, but not anymore. China is a super important market. So what I've seen is big, you know, ex-US licensees want China as part of that ex-US territory. And I find that, you know, biotech companies, if they're licensing out, want to make sure that who they're licensing out to for the rest of the world really know what they're doing in China. because China is so complex and so valuable, they don't want to miss the opportunity. And so I do see more and more deals that are China-only deals, but not because China is kind of a one-off market, but more because China is such an important market and such a complex market that if you don't do it right, you miss the boat. And I'm curious, I think, Oren, you've done some deals in China. Isabella, of course, you've got a lot of experience there. So just curious about what you're seeing.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of China-specific deals, and it's been great to have Isabella and team to bounce things off of, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of nuance that comes about in Greater China. And we're seeing, I guess, to your point, Isabella, these are not really specific, just distribution-only deals. These tend to be now more complex, where there's development activities occurring locally, and then you have issues of, how you coordinate that development activity, who has access to the results from that development activity, right? Because you often have economics, right? There's significant economics that you're paying to conduct the studies. So whoever is conducting it doesn't want everyone else free riding on them. So there's issues of, do you get to buy in later and have access to that? And then, as Isabella pointed out, I guess there's now these privacy issues with data coming out. So you need to have a thought at the beginning of the process of how you're going to handle these development activities and access, right? If you want access to trial results, you should know that in advance so you can make sure you're not running into issues where they can't export the data, for example. So I don't know if others have had that issue, or Isabella, if there's ways to address sort of that export piece, but I think that's something folks should keep in mind.
Yeah, I would just say that, right, in terms of data sharing. So I think one of the common ways we see is, in terms of clinical trial data specifically. So there's been quite active, right, prevalent data sharing in the past in any event. So really to have that access of data as opposed to being told later on, say, oh, actually there are restrictions as to transfer, is to be, right, one of the ways we see commonly is for the parties to be co-sponsors, right, of the clinical trial. So there's no data transfer per se, because at the point of data creation, it's already sort of jointly available, right, made accessible to the parties. So these are things that, as you said, Oren, we need to really think about and structure. And then, as I mentioned, right, there are different mechanisms that we can consider in terms of data, in terms of, right, human genetic resources is a consideration. But also just coming back to the point, right, we see a lot of the deals, it's really being active, right? China is part of the licensing deal sort of worldwide. So both license in and license out, actually, I was looking at industry report licensing deal just to share with everyone. I think there have been some 45 reported license in to September just this year. And then in the past year, right, I think in terms of the type of product licensed, I think there's still more of the monoclonal antibodies and small molecules. And then in terms of field, still focused on oncology and autoimmunity. But very interestingly is the license out deals, right? We're seeing more and more Chinese companies, biotech companies, pharma companies who are licensing out their pipeline. So I think, as they really strengthen the R&D capabilities, just to share, license out is reported 23 deals in 2020 and 13 deals until September this year. The focus, I think, for the license out has been on PD-1, PD-L1. And then I would just say, right, in August, this is probably one of the biggest deal and the most recent, August this year, Remgen granted exclusive license to Seagen for the development and commercialization of its novel antibody drug conjugate for cancer treatment. So this involves upfront payment of $200 million and up to 2.4 billion milestone payments, potentially in royalties, of course. And the territory, Remgen granted license Asia, excluding Japan and Singapore, and Seagen gets the rest of the world. So I think it's going to be very interesting time to see a greater mix of both in and out involving China. And quite interesting to say, right? China, often we see Greater China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, but actually in terms of legal, as a separate legal jurisdictions, Hong Kong has its own laws and regulations, and Taiwan, of course, has its very established pharmaceutical laws and regulations. So really not treating them as the same, but usually they come bundled together.
Yeah, I think, as Isabel pointed out, I think this is a huge shift in China not just being a regional player, a regional distributor, but their desire to be a global pharmaceutical player, and their innovation now where they're out licensing their own clinical assets, and also a desire on their deals. What I've seen is some deal structures where the Chinese companies have an option to fund a percentage of the global development, and in exchange get a percentage of the global profits on global sales, not just sales in Greater China. So obviously there's this huge push and a lot of activity in that market.
Yeah, absolutely. And I recently worked on a deal. I think Oren also worked with the same company on another deal at the same time. A Chinese company, a Chinese large biotech that got global rights to a product. So and definitely a focus by Chinese pharma companies to expand into the rest of the world themselves, and have that infrastructure for clinical development and commercialization. Let me just pick up one more question I have on this topic, and we'll move to the next two. But on an item, Denis, that you had mentioned about pricing, where you have regional licensees, I think I've seen some deals where the licensor, let's say a U.S. licensor out to regional licensees around the world, will want to know what the licensees are doing in terms of pricing to the extent that they can under antitrust constraints, because they're going to get the economic return from those net sales in the form of a royalty, and they want to know where the pricing is going to be. But I've also seen situations more and more where the licensees want to know what the licensor is going to do in pricing, have some window into it, some influence back in the US, even though they don't have economic participation in US sales. And I think that the world is kind of gearing up for the day when the US, as such a big market, becomes a reference price is a reference price essentially in pricing around the world, and where the flip happens when the US, if and when the US implements pricing controls and pricing approvals. And so I just want to pick up on what you were referencing before, Denis, and just see what experience any of you have had with the interest of licensees, regional licensees, wanting to have some window into pricing outside of their particular region.
Yeah, I have not come across the issue of the license. Well, obviously, any pricing, right, potentially impacts on a global basis can impact a company's ability to price in their markets, right? So there's always this desire to understand kind of the pricing and things of that nature. But the assumption has always been that the U.S. will obviously have a higher price, and they're motivated, the licensor, to achieve the highest price they can. Where I've seen a lot of the issues on pricing is in China, where licensors are concerned about what the price there is. Again, potentially as a result of China maybe a future reference country, or essentially, I think there's just some kind of unease or not understanding clearly how pricing is done in China, and the concern about free products and discounts and things of that nature. So there is a push to kind of agree on pricing, but Chinese antitrust laws, Isabel, maybe you can comment on this further, is there's a restriction on really the licensor being able to kind of have a veto or final say on pricing in China, which kind of potentially kind of raises, at least in one of the deals we did, raised an issue, because that was an important point for the licensor. So we'll try to kind of structure around that point. But I don't know, maybe Isabella, you can comment on the antitrust aspect of that piece.
Yeah, Dennis. Yeah. Indeed, right. So we have colleagues sort of specialized in this area and sort of akin to retail self maintenance. So you can't really stipulate the pricing, right, of your distributor or downstream pricing. And I think added complication to that is you mentioned about drug pricing in China, for example. I mean, Taiwan will have its own challenges because I think different jurisdictions in Asia, very sort of different, right, in terms of the healthcare structure and how sort of pricing and procurement is done. So in China, drug pricing is subject to centralized negotiation with the National Healthcare Security Administration. So that's the public health insurer. So it's really a tendering and bidding process. And you might have heard, right, in the past 2 years, it's very heavily discounted negotiated pricing out of that process. So, I think on the whole, there's less control, I think, generally available for sort of foreign collaborators for the drug pricing in China. But there are other factors that are taken into consideration. For example, the patent portfolio supporting the relevant drug in China can put into different bracket, allowing for different margins to be attached to the drug in question. So yeah, it's very complicated. Sort of goes back to Randy, your point, right? I was looking at China as a sort of a standalone, just because of the complexity in terms of the life cycle, as well as product development.
Well, it is certainly complex, and I think we're going to come back to this a little bit in the context, as you had mentioned earlier, Isabella, about cell and gene therapy, manufacturing, and regional deals in a minute. I first want to kind of flip to a different topic on the fluidity between licensing and M&A. We've seen a lot of fluidity in deal structures between these two. One regional deal that I worked on, kind of based on what we were just talking about, where a biotech company in the U.S. was licensing out ex-U.S. but not the U.S. So a partial world deal, and the licensee really wanted access to the U.S. market, was negotiating to have maybe a co-promotion in the U.S. And finally acquired the U.S. biotech company in order to get the U.S. market plus the rest of the world. And we see this sometimes happen with companies that are a single product company, where essentially licensing the product and buying the company can be kind of not too different in terms of valuation. But it gets more complex when what would have been the licensor on a product actually has more products in the pipeline, and valuations can get the valuation can get a little bit more complex in terms of bridging gaps in terms of the perceived values. So just want to kind of see what experience you have all had with the challenges of M&A deals versus licensing deals, and also the similarities, because there certainly is some crossover aspects of these deals.
Yeah, I think, like Randy, what you pointed out is when you have a single asset, right? Most biotech companies, if they're going to do a deal, if it's a single asset company, generally just from a tax perspective, it's just way more efficient to sell the company, sell the stock, at least from the U.S. perspective, and have significant tax savings, as opposed to doing licensing collaboration where the upfront goes to the company, and the company is, to the extent it doesn't have NOLs to shield that income, has a lot of potential taxable gain, and then it has to distribute that cash out the door, and there's another layer of tax there. So just from a tax efficiency standpoint, usually biotechs, if it's a single asset entity and they don't see the asset as growing, or where there could be there's a platform behind it where they can generate more platforms. I mean, I think they're pushing for the ideal tax structure is to kind of sell the entire company. And it's funny, on the flip side, I've seen scenarios where you have a company, a biotech, really focused on doing the licensing deal, and that's what they want to do. And the pharma potentially would rather acquire the company, but and they'll go into the process to learn more about the company, right? To do due diligence on the asset, and then try to flip it to an M&A transaction, which can be challenging, right? Because when you sign a confidentiality agreement, you say that you're going to only use the confidential information for the purpose of the deal, which is the licensing deal, and not use that confidential information to potentially come up with the price to buy the company. And obviously, this is a bigger issue in public company deals than private company, because a private company can always just say no. So that's kind of some of the issues that I've seen there. As far as similarities, especially on the contingent payments, right? I think most M&A deals and licensing deals share kind of the milestone component. Milestone payments are kind of a big part of the deal consideration. Even in M&A, they're usually to bridge the valuation gap. There's usually always back end kind of milestone payments, whether whether it's development milestones such as a program reaching a certain stage of development, regulatory milestones such as approvals for an initial indication, and then additional indications, and approvals based on achieving milestones in different geographic regions, the US, the EU, or China or Japan. And then you have kind of sales-based milestones, kind of achieving net sale thresholds. In licensing deals, though, you always have royalties as well. And you don't really see royalties paid out much in M&A. And essentially, it's probably due to the administrative burden of constantly paying out quarterly payments over a long period of time, and then having all those payments go to some kind of central distribution that gets dispersed out to other shareholders. And I think also in M&A deals, you're focused on getting the consideration in a shorter time period, and royalties obviously can be paid over like a 10, 15, 20-year period of time. So that's what I see the difference on the consideration. The other piece, I guess, is the commercial reasonable effort standards. It's generally the same, but in M&A, you potentially see more concrete steps that have to be taken, such as conducting a program through a phase 2 trial or phase 3 trial, absent safety issues. Sometimes you see minimum spend required. I've seen where buyers have committed to budgeting X dollars for development. So I think there's more focus on the commercial reasonable efforts and the milestones to kind of achieving the milestones, more specific and concrete, to do so in a shorter period of time, probably because there's more at stake, I would imagine. The other big issue is the duration. On the M&A side, a lot of time is focused on duration, because in a licensing deal, as long as you're continuing development, right, I guess pharma really shouldn't be concerned about using commercial reasonable efforts. It's continuing to do so. But in an M&A deal, what happens if there is a product failure, or there's better technology out there and they decided to put their eggs behind the other basket? The last thing you want to do in an M&A, from an M&A perspective, is you buy the company, buy the asset, and then be sued because you didn't develop the resources enough. So I think there's a lot more focus on the commercial reasonable effort standards in kind of M&A deals, both kind of on the buy side and on the sell side.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I have to say, I have seen now one deal, a body of one, where there is a royalty. So there's a deal that is going on in Europe right now. It's still being negotiated, that our colleagues in Europe are doing, and I was helping on a little bit. And there's contingent payments for development success, and then some net sales payments for commercial milestones. And there's actually a royalty for some number of years post-launch. So unusual to see that.
Yeah, although you can add one more to your data set. I have a term sheet we'll see if the deal happens, but the term sheet that includes that same royalties going forward.
Yeah, and I think that points to that, these CVRs and the CRE, the commercial reasonable efforts obligation, started off pretty weak, I think, in M&A deals. It was kind of, to bridge the gap, and it was kind of, 10 years ago or whatever, it was new to M&A, while it was very established in licensing deals and very complex in licensing deals. M&A took a very simple approach to it, and it was probably a smaller portion of the overall value that was being paid that way. But as valuations have gotten bigger and they need to bridge bigger gaps, I think this has all gotten a lot more complex and sophisticated in the M&A deals. So let me turn back. We have a few more minutes left. Let me turn back to one of the topics we were talking about in the regional deals, but in the context of the kind of really complex technologies that we're seeing more and more, cell and gene therapy especially, biomarker deals, all kinds of genetic information kind of focused deals, which can be products, it can be very early stage research. And one of the a deal that I had recently, the term sheet punted what is a licensed product. The whole definition of a licensed product, typically, you'd see it's any pharmaceutical product that incorporates the compound or the molecule. There was none of that. No one knew what this product was really going to look like. And I know that Oren, you've worked on, Denis, you've worked on also cell and gene therapy deals. Isabella, it's a very big area in China. Curious what you're seeing about the range of complexity of what the components that go into what these products are, and how you track who made the contribution, who's got the IP over those components.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting time. I mean, we're seeing products sort of morph into process almost, right? If you have a cell therapy, like an autologous cell therapy where you're extracting cells from a patient, then doing something, and then re-injecting cells back into a patient, right? The product isn't just a pill that you're popping in someone's mouth, right? There's a whole process that goes into making that product that sort of is the product in a sense, right? It's not specific to any one composition because it's going to vary across patients. So it makes it very interesting, I guess, technologically, and then contractually to think about, what if we take that autologous cell therapy, what's the royalty going to be paid on? Is pricing going to be one price for the whole process, or is it going to be somehow broken down? And then it adds additional thought into how you deal with manufacturing, right? Traditional manufacturing, you could outsource, right? And the selling party and the manufacturer could be different, but now you have a process where you're manufacturing as you go, at least part of the product. So is that the same? Can you have a difference between the manufacturer and the seller? So I think there's a lot of things just to think about as these technologies evolve, and just to be careful as the contracts get drafted and make sure you're thinking through these issues.
Hey, Randy, we do have one question. I don't know if we want to do that.
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah. So I don't know if you want me to take a crack at that, or do you want to do that?
Yeah, I was going to ask whether, one of our panelists, Julia Schieber from our Zurich office, became ill and wasn't able to attend. And, that would have been perfect EU perspective, but Denis, please do.
Yeah, no, sure. So the question is, there's a kind of early stage med device company, and they're considering getting a partner to basically exploit the product in the EU, and whether they should do it through a licensing arrangement or some kind of a joint venture. And I guess obviously it's somewhat of a complicated question, but a joint venture, a real joint venture, is very complicated. And there are always issues about transferring assets in. What happens, and really the big issue, what happens if the parties decide to not move forward? There's buy-sell rights. It's very complicated. It's much more expensive than doing a licensing transaction. So generally speaking, I don't see many joint ventures unless there's a real tax advantage to structuring it as a joint venture, as opposed to a virtual JV, which is a license, could be like a virtual JV, as opposed to a physical real JV where you form a company, both sides put money in, they contribute assets, because generally a lot of times these things don't work out, and the complexity is in dissolving it. And when you have a license agreement, it's much simpler to provide notice to terminate. You don't have to retransfer assets out, things of that nature. So I think it's much simpler to do a license, and I guess it really needs to be reviewed to see whether there's some significant tax or other reasons why you would do kind of a real JV. I don't know if anybody else, those are my kind of initial thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, I've seen some, actual JV entities formed over the years, and the complexity of just establishing them. Is it going to have employees? Is it going to have service agreements with the two partners? is it can get very bogged down and very expensive, as you said. And a virtual JV, essentially a licensing agreement, can accomplish almost all the goals, I think, of an actual physical JV. And so from the question, it just seems perhaps, if the company is thinking about forming an EU subsidiary anyway to operate in the EU, they could do that, and that EU subsidiary could have a, like you said, Dennis, a licensing arrangement, a collaboration type agreement with the investor / partner, and that may be cleaner and easier to operate and to unwind if that comes, than having the EU investor partner actually be a shareholder in the actually together running this EU company. But that's just thoughts off the top of our heads. Anybody else have anything on that one? Okay, then I think we're also at the end of the session. So I would like to thank the audience for the question and for joining us. And we hope that we've provided a meaningful discussion for you. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks, everybody.